So after we finished putting the cover panels on the island, we noticed that despite leveling the floor, we still had a few gaps under it. And we also had gaps at the top. So we needed to add some trim. Remember the stuff that we used on the toe kicks to hide the gap? The polystyrene trim? Well, they make it in a shoe molding, and we took that same paint that we had color matched to the toe kicks and we painted it and we used that for the trim, and I was able to use my low temp hot glue gun. I added a strip along both sides and then along the top where it meets the countertop. I added one along the floor as well, and it just framed it in very nicely. I neatly mitered the corners using the miter saw. And last, I put a strip underneath the counter on the sides where the two panels meet the counter. So nearly 20 years ago, we renovated a former house and installed all the flooring ourselves and installed all the baseboards, which included painting a lot of them. And I said, never again will I do baseboards, but sometimes to get things done the way you want, you have to do it yourself. We bought 12-foot long baseboards. They were pre-primed, but I still gave them 2 coats of oil-based paint. And I discovered a quality brush really matters. It just put such a nice coating on and was well worth the extra cost over the cheaper brushes. And because our baseboards were 4¼ inches tall, we bought a new miter saw because it claimed, well, we thought it said it can cut vertically 5½, but what it says is it can support 5½ inches, but it cannot cut it because the motor gets in the way. That was quite a disappointment. I found a way to make it work though. I found you had about 1 inch that you could cut off with the board vertically. So all I had to do was mark where I needed to make my miter cut and then lay it flat on the table of the miter saw and cut 1 inch away. Now I could stand it up vertically and cut my miter cut. When I first started cutting boards, they were always too short and it drove me nuts. And then I realized that the blades have a thickness that I need to consider when I'm placing the mark. So if this is the board you want to cut, and this is the mark you want to cut on, if you leave it dead center here and don't take into consideration the thickness of your saw blade, this is what's going to happen when you cut. Now your board is going to be too short. You want to slide the board over with the mark off center here to allow for the thickness of that blade. Now your cut is precisely on your line. You did not cut your board too short. So always consider the thickness of the blade, and this is true whether you are using a hand saw or a miter saw. One thing I changed this time around was how I cut my miter corners. Instead of 45 degrees, I made inside corner cuts 44¼ degree and outside corners 45¾ degree. They came together so much cleaner this way. Another thing I did was I cut all of my pieces and then I glued all of them together before I put them in place against the wall. This made a huge difference in how clean my corners came out. I used hot glue and it worked great. When we had the laminate floors laid, we decided to keep some areas the porcelain tile, such as the hallways and the entry. And what we didn't realize was they were different height floors. So when it came time to install baseboards, we had a bit of a problem. One of the solutions was just to take a baseboard and span the 2 different floors, and then on the low side, fill in with caulk. But that would have looked terrible. That would have meant 1/4 inch caulk in some areas. That's what the floor company planned to do, and why I said, no thank you, I'll do it myself. The second option is to use one of these ornamental molding pieces, they call it. And that would have worked okay, but I didn't particularly like the look of it. So I chose door number 3, which is this. And this is what that looks like. I'm not sure what it's called, but I will show you how I did it. So as you can see in the photo, the kitchen floor is just slightly taller than the hallway floor. And so we're going to make these cuts first. We are going to cut at a 22.5-degree angle this direction. I've taken the cut pieces and placed them on the floor so that the opening is in the opening of the gap between the floors. Now we're going to make the piece that will fit in this gap. To do that, we're going to cut this direction 22.5 degrees. And we're going to make a second cut to create a very skinny piece. And to get the measurement for that, we're going to measure the gap. We will measure from here to here. So here is that measurement that we just took. And we're going to make our cut. Now we are going to take that skinny piece and put it in place. And there you have it. You will fill in any gaps with wood filler and sand and then paint over it. I used this plastic wood filler and it worked great, but next time I would look for a white version because it took 3, sometimes 4 coats of paint to completely cover. Something to keep in mind, you are not always going to be able to have the 2 boards meet where the gap is. As in these 2 instances, the floor dropped down and immediately made a turn. So I had to put where the 2 boards meet on the higher floor, as seen in these 2 examples. So every situation is going to be different, but you should be able to apply this technique pretty much everywhere, provided your floors are not extremely different in their heights. Sometimes the sheetrock did not go all the way down and left a gap. And when I would place the baseboard there and nail it in, the force of the nail gun would push the bottom of the baseboard in so that the top slanted out. And so to prevent that, I used popsicle sticks and I would fill the gap. Sometimes it would take 1, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, but it kept the baseboard from going in at the bottom when I nailed it in. We have this angled wall here, so we bought one of these little steel protractors. And remember, whatever the measurement comes out, you divide that by 2. So ours measured 46 degrees, so I cut the 2 boards that met there 23 degrees on the miter saw. When I cut the end of my caulking tube, I cut a very small amount off so that the hole is very small. I also cut it at an angle, and then I used sandpaper to make it pointy. Then I put a line on the back with a permanent marker so that I know how to position the caulking tube as I'm applying it. The hole that I make in the tube is so small a finishing nail just fits into it, and I tape it up when I'm taking a break. And I have a very good caulking gun that releases the pressure, so when you're done, it doesn't just keep pumping out caulk. There is really no need to tape. If you don't cut too big of a hole, you won't have a big gloppy mess on the wall. I use this wood putty to fill in the holes. The putty is labeled white, but it's not white enough, so I did take a foam brush and brushed a thin layer of the paint over the tops. And I was done. I'm glad we decided to do the baseboards ourselves because we were able to do things the way we wanted, even though it creates a huge mess. In the end, the results are worth it. And Waffles thinks they look very nice. All we have left are the transition pieces that go between the floors, and boy have they improved things these days. Back when I first installed baseboards, you had to know what profile you needed. But now they give you one piece that can be cut to be one of 3 different profiles, and it's just wonderful. The most challenging part was cutting around the corners, and you had to do it just perfectly because the way these work is you install a channel into the floor that the transition piece gets hammered into. And you can see how it grips it. Once you've got that hammered in, you are not getting it back out. So you have to get it right the first time. So I created a template I used some brown postal paper and created a perfect template with the angles cut. So all I had to do was transfer that to the actual transition piece. And then I knew that it would fit from one end to the other. The flooring company did not leave us with a straight gap to work with. So we could not lay the piece that goes in it down the middle. I'll show you how we solve that problem. So this is the part we will be installing in this gap. Now, if they had cut a straight line on the floor, we would have known where to put the center of this, but we don't because it's wavy. So what we did is we laid the transition piece where it needed to go. Then I laid a piece of tape along this edge, the edge facing the tile. And I carefully measured from the edge that would be on the tile to the edge of this place, because this is what's going to go in that groove. And I made tick marks on the concrete floor. This told my husband where to lay the channel. This is a photo showing the tape and where I put the tick marks. My husband used a hammer drill and these concrete screws to install that channel on the concrete floor. And then he used a hammer with a small piece of wood to gently tap the transition piece in, starting from one end and working his way down. Oh, that's nice. That's nice.
I'll go over it again yet. Actually,
the circled piece is the channel that gets installed. These two extra pieces are simply to put under it if you need to raise the height. We repeated this for the other areas that needed transition pieces, and they all came out looking great. Waffles thinks it looks wonderful. We removed the two chandeliers that were in the breakfast room and kitchen because we wanted to put up two ceiling fans with lights. We used the laser level that I talk about in part 2 to figure out where in the ceiling to make our hole for the one in the breakfast room. And we set it on the floor until it was centered on the fish tank. And then we made sure it was centered on the one window. And when doing that, it puts a line up on the ceiling where they meet. And so we knew where the hole was that we needed to make. We need to be sure that location is okay and going to work up in the attic. So first we make a very small hole, just big enough to get a 1/4 inch dowel up. We shove it up through the insulation so that when my husband goes up, he can find it. Once my husband determined that the location was good and between two studs, he cut the hole from in the attic while I held a bucket up against the ceiling to catch all the dust. Our plan was to use one of these fan brackets, and we have put up probably 24 fans using this type bracket. It is so easy to use.
Insert the bar through a 4-inch hole in the ceiling. Twist the bar to lock the safety brace into the joist. Pull the wires into the outlet box and install the outlet box onto the electrical box bracket.
So once the bracket was up, my husband used the wiring that was to the former chandelier to wire the ceiling fan, and we had a ceiling fan up. We did the exact same procedure in the kitchen, first inserting a dowel, making sure everything was okay, putting in the bracket, and installing the ceiling fan. And we did use the laser level, but we had to estimate where because we did not have the counter. But it turns out we got lucky. Ceiling fan in the kitchen. Oh my goodness, Brian, and the fan looks like it's exactly centered. So because we were not having upper cabinets, we would not have any under cabinet lights to light our countertops in the evening. So we had to come up with a solution. I tried a couple of wall lights, but they were so harsh, especially at night. We discovered these 4-inch flush mount LED lights, and they were perfect because they are dimmable. So we can have soft light or bright light, whatever we need, and they could not have been easier to install. We once again made use of our new laser level. It made it so easy to mark where to cut the holes for these can lights. We just measured out the amount we wanted to come out from the wall on one end and made the same mark on the other end and snapped a line. You can see the little laser level sitting on the counter. The best thing about these lights is they are only a ½ inch tall, so there was no need to drill a small hole and test the area first. They will fit even where there is a stud. So my husband used this 4 1/4 drill bit, and he set the drill on reverse. It will still cut through the sheetrock, but it creates a little less dust. Careful. That was quick. Believe it or not, that was less dust. So after the holes were drilled, it was just a matter of snapping in the fixtures. My husband had gone up and wired one of the boxes. And after that, you piggyback them together. You will need extra Romex to do that. So the only time my husband had to go up in the attic was to wire the first box. And they are push fittings, so it made it quite quick. And the rest of the work he did from below. He was able to insert the lengths of Romex between holes, and each one is push in. So quite easy to piggyback from one unit to the next. We had to buy a dimmer switch for the wall, but then we were done. I'm going to turn on, I go slow so I don't make anybody dizzy. Brian just installed that, so let's see if it works. Push the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Holy cow, wonderful.
Dim it.
And it dims. Brian, that's so cool. It lights up the counter, as you can see, for nighttime work.
Yep.
Good job, Brian. This is the sink we'll be installing, and I just love it. It's so beautiful and it functions so well. The instructions are very clear, and they say to put a bead of caulk on the underneath side around the lip. But we didn't think that was enough, so we put an additional one on the counter. So they tell you to turn the sink upside down and put a bead of caulk around the edge. But as you can see, the edge is quite tall, so we didn't think that was enough. So we put masking tape around the edge, and that way we would know where to put the caulk, because we put an additional bead on the counter. So we removed the sink and flipped it upside down, and we added a bead of caulk inside the blue tape. Then we added another bead of caulk on the inside of the sink underneath it, where they show in the directions to put it. Then we installed the sink. Those two beads of caulk would meet and form a watertight seal. We used clear silicone caulk, and the hardest part of installing the sink was getting the hooks in, because in this photo it looks like there's a lot of room between where you hook it and the sink, but there's not. It's very cramped. I had to use a pair of needle nose pliers to help me get some of them up there, because you only have maybe an inch to work in. This is the hook that I'm talking about, and you can see it here. Once we had all the hooks in and tightened down, we put a big bucket in the sink and filled it with water and let it sit overnight. My husband put in all new plumbing and plumbed the dishwasher, and since we had just bought the faucet recently, we reused it, and then we were good to go. Oh, yeah, I can try that too. We're leaving the doors off just so we can check for leaks overnight. And then tonight we will run the dishwasher for the first time. I love this sink so much. I think my favorite parts are the little rack on top that you can use for drying a couple of dishes. And the big rack in the bottom is surprisingly wonderful. I just love it. Look, Kathy, I splurged on this little garbage can. It just fits. I had no idea these soap dispensers existed, but you just install the hand pump on top and then you run a tube down and put it inside a big bottle of soap. You don't have to refill anything. When the soap is gone, you just put a new bottle on. It is so wonderful. When we renovated that former house 20 years ago, we also gutted the kitchen. And we paid a carpenter to install the cabinets, but we installed the backsplash tile. It was these little tiny mosaics, and that was quite fun. So I knew I wanted to do the backsplash again here. And I also knew it would be harder because we were working with much larger tiles. So these are the tiles. Aren't they gorgeous? And see how the patterns line up between the tiles, so it just goes on and on. The edges are nice and straight. That's called rectified. They're gorgeous. The tile is considered 3D, and I searched everywhere for how to cut 3D tiles, but could not find anything. And so we bought this 4-inch wet tile saw and tried it out. I had bought various samples of the tile and used them to try the saw. And oh my gosh, it just did the most amazing job. We had some tricky cuts, including skinny ones, like under the window. And it was an amazing little saw. Okay, this saw is awesome. Look at this. I was able to cut this skinny little piece off. This is the edge that I cut. Isn't that lovely? Powerful little saw. To make sure our cuts were straight, we used the clamp guide that I talk about in part 3. And we also used a set of clamps to hold the tile down. We flipped the saw upside down and took a measurement of how far it was between the side of the blade and its guide. This measurement would tell us how far back to place the clamp guide. In this case, it was 3 9/16 inches. We did have to raise the blade a bit so that the housing of the saw would clear the guide. We worked outside on a sturdy table, and we first laid down one of those carpet gripper things and placed our tile on that. Then we laid a 2x6 over that and clamped it down tightly. We put a piece of masking tape where we were going to draw our cut line, and then carefully measured and drew that. We put a second piece of masking tape in the general area of where we were going to mark the line for the guide. And we measured our 3 9/16 inches and marked that line. And this is where we would put our guide. The space between those two lines should measure the 3 9/16 inches. Then you're ready to saw. Everything went well until we got to the tiles for around the window. And we could clamp this way to cut this line, but we could not clamp this way to cut this line. So we had to freehand it. And the water kept covering over the line, so it was hard to see, but we finally did it. And we only broke 2 tiles in the process. I saved my large Ikea boxes that the cabinets came in and used them to protect the cabinets. Then I taped along the counter and along the wall to protect it. Then we cut every single tile and dry fit them against the wall using tape. Everything about this job is messy, from using the wet saw to the dust from the tiles and the messy mortar. We wore masks to protect ourselves from the dust, both from the mixing of the mortar and from the cutting of the tiles. We purchased this mortar, which is made for large format tiles, and we bought one of these paddle mixers because you don't want to incorporate too much air into it. My husband did have to use his larger drill because the smaller one started smoking. I got two different kinds of sponges. I preferred the squared off edges for cleaning off the mortar, and I like the rounded edges for after I grouted. And then I got this margin trowel, they call it, for cleaning off the mortar around the edge so it wouldn't push out between the tiles. This is the trowel that I bought, and it had a very comfortable handle, so I liked it a lot. I found using the notch trowel really messy to get the mortar out of the bucket and also to apply it to the back of the tile, so I used this putty knife, and I would scoop out mortar that way and either put it on the back of the tile or directly onto the notched trowel. And this is the leveling system we used, and it worked so well. I did want to protect the tiles from them, and while they do make protectors, as you can see on the package, they don't completely protect the tile from the yellow piece, and I especially worried since this is three-dimensional. So I bought some Mylar off of Amazon and made my own. I cut 2x4 pieces I did not measure, I just estimated and just eyeballed it. And then I cut a slit in the center without going all the way through. And this worked great. And you can see it completely protects the tile from those little yellow pieces. We use these shims, they're the same ones we used in part 2, between the tiles and the countertop to leave a space for caulking later. Last, I bought a 3-gallon bucket, which is the one on the right. It's a little shorter than the 5-gallon buckets, but it was so much easier to scoop up the mortar. I didn't have to put my whole arm down in the bucket. We made sure we had several buckets of water and several bowls of water because it's important to clean off the mortar off the surface as soon as possible. Well, that's convenient. This is a video from Home Depot, and I thought I would use it to mention a few things, like up here where the mortar has squished out. Don't leave that to dry. I kept a box of popsicle sticks handy, and I scooped that out while it was still wet. And these are those leveling things that I used. And when people complained about them, it was because these white things did not break off afterwards. And you want to be sure to, after you apply the mortar, scrape away this area right by the tile adjacent. That's what that trowel, margin trowel, is for. Because if you get a bunch of the mortar on the white piece right here, it's going to harden and it's going to make it hard for it to break off cleanly. And you'll have to be digging in there to get pieces off. So that was the major complaint. If you do a neat job and keep those white pieces clean, then they will break off cleanly. You don't need the tool. You can use your hand to push these in. If I was doing a big surface like a floor, I would use their tool. We tiled the butler's pantry first since it's a small area, and this is how we did things. Using the laser level, we snapped 2 lines, one in the very center and the second one where the top of the tiles would go. This would show us where to apply the mortar. We lightly drew pencil lines over those. We applied the mortar going up and down. We did this because after we put the tile on, we would wiggle it left to right to collapse the ridges. Before we set the tile, we laid our 1/8 inch shims along the counter, which would leave us a gap to apply the caulk later. Then I set the tile and again moved it left to right. I did back butter the tile before I set it. Back buttering is where you take the straight edge of the trowel and apply a very thin layer to the back. Next, I put in the white leveling pieces before I forget. Then I applied the mortar to the right side. This time I went left to right because I don't have room to push that tile left to right to collapse the ridges, so I'm going to have to go up and down. Then I set that tile, and before I forget, I put in those little white pieces that will level it later. At this point, I can put the Mylar sheets that I cut and the yellow levelers in their spots. And I make sure the tiles are level and flush with each other before I move on to apply the mortar here. So there's the mortar there, and then I set that tile and apply these white leveling pieces before I forget. And I put the mylar sheets and the yellow things to level. And basically I just repeat this process for the top. I use my laser to mark where the top line will be and mark where the center tile will go. I apply the mortar, then the tile, and apply my white leveling pieces. And at this point, I put the mylar and yellow leveling things between these two tiles. You want to do this as you go because you don't want the mortar to set up on you. Then I apply the mortar on the right and that tile, and I put in my mylar little sheets and the yellow pieces there. The mortar goes on the left, and then that tile and the mylar sheets with the yellow levelers there. I cleaned up mortar from the front of the tiles as I went, and then I let everything sit overnight. So things that I learned doing the butler's pantry is I'm glad I did not mix the whole bag of mortar. On the directions they show pouring in the whole bag. We measured out using a scale half a bag, and that was more than enough to do that small section. You only have so much time that you can let the stuff sit in the bucket before you have to use it. So don't mix more than you're going to use in about 45 minutes. The other thing I learned was it's really hard to apply the mortar to the wall because it's a vertical surface. So when I did the rest of the kitchen, I applied the mortar on the back of the tile and then put the very thin butter coat on the wall, and that worked much better. The protectors worked amazingly well, as did the levelers. I don't think I could have done as good a job without them. The following day, I used my rubber mallet and knocked the levelers off, and they came off cleanly. We continued around the rest of the kitchen and mixing half a bag of mortar at a time. In all, we used less than 2 full bags of the mortar. When I applied the mortar to the tile, I stayed about ½ an inch away from the edge. I do recommend pre-cutting the tiles if you are doing big ones like we did. I highly recommend that little tile saw, and I highly recommend these levelers. They were just wonderful to work with. Of course, now there's a total mess to clean up, and we'll let it dry overnight before we remove the leveling things, whatever you want to call them. But it's not perfect. We broke 2 tiles attempting to cut the ones for around the window, but that's the way it goes. I made quite a bit of mess down there, but oh well, I'll clean it up later. The next day, I used a mallet and broke off those white leveling pieces, and they came off quite cleanly. Before we grouted, I used this caulk and caulked in the space underneath the tiles where they meet the counter. I took my tile sample up to get the right color, and I mixed the grout in this 3-gallon bucket and used this float to apply it. I took an extra step to protect the tiles so that I didn't have a lot of grout haze to scrub and clean off afterwards. I taped on sheets of parchment paper and just left the lines that needed grout exposed, and this really helped minimize all the cleaning afterwards. Grouting is easy. You just need to remember to hold your float at a 45-degree angle and apply it at an angle across the lines. Do not go in the same direction the lines are going, in other words. We started in the butler's pantry, and at first I thought I had picked the wrong color because the grout looked so dark, but in a couple of hours when it dried, it lightened up quite a bit. Well, son of a gun. Brian told me it would lighten up, and it already has. Look. Praise the Lord. We took a break to make cornbread and prep for Thanksgiving, which would be the next day. And then we worked the rest of the day to get the kitchen completed and everything cleaned up. Grouting is a messy job, but at the end of the day, we were so thankful with how it turned out. It's just beautiful. We saw a vent hood at Ikea that we really liked and planned to use it in our renovation, but we didn't think it would perform very well. So we ended up getting this Samsung, which had the same appearance, but a much better movement of air, as you can see by this comparison. The Ikea moved 270 CFMs and the Samsung 630. Besides having a stronger airflow, the Samsung is a smart appliance, so we can tell Alexa to turn the fan on and off. When we renovated our kitchen at our former house, we did install the vent hood ourselves, but it was just going to be in the same location and go through the same hole up into the attic. This time we wanted to go through the exterior wall. We called a company to get a price on installation, and they wanted $660 to install it, which seemed like a lot considering the unit only cost $700. So we decided to do it ourselves, and we are so glad we did. It was quite an easy job, even cutting through the bricks. We used this 6 1/4 inch carbide tipped hole saw and this semi-rigid duct, which is rated for heat. And you want to be sure this is what you get and not the stuff for the clothes dryer. Then we use these clamps and some duct tape, and this is the hood we used on the outside. When we installed the backsplash tile, we centered one directly behind the range. And so we used our laser level to find the center of that in order to install the bracket. Then we hung the vent hood up there temporarily so I could draw lines along both sides where this cover goes. Everything has to stay within that cover. So this is the area where we attach the ductwork. And in a perfect world, we would be able just to go straight up and drill a hole and go straight out. But we discovered there was a stud behind the wall right where we needed to drill. So we would have to come up and over and drill here, making sure we stayed inside the guidelines that I drew, because this is where that cover goes. And this is what that would look like. Making that big cut through the wall was the most stressful part of this job. So we must have measured 3 times to be sure everything was right where it needed to be between the lines, and then we made our cut. And I'll show you how we did it. First, my husband used a long, skinny masonry bit and drilled through the wall all the way through the bricks. He made sure the drill was completely level by watching the bubble. Then he put on the 6 1/4 inch drill bit and drilled just through the sheetrock. The blade cannot cut through the insulation, so he used a pair of scissors to cut out the insulation in the wall. Then he went outside and drilled through the bricks to complete the hole. Now all we need to do is slide in the vent. He screwed it in and used caulk around it on the outside. This is what it looks like from the outside, and this is what it looks like from the inside. The rest of the installation went very quickly after that. We hung it back up, and my husband permanently secured it to the brackets. Then he wired it, and I was creeped out by the gaps around the vent and around where the power cords came in, so I stuffed insulation in there just to keep any bugs out. After cutting the ductwork to the proper length, my husband put it over the adapter and the hood, and it was a very tight fit, but we used the duct tape around it and the clamps just to make sure it was secured. Husband made sure the cover would fit. The cover is actually 2 covers, a upper one and a lower one, so you can get the height you need to cover all the ductwork. And it couldn't be simpler to install. It has an upper bracket for the top piece, and then the bottom piece just fits to the top piece with magnets. This makes for a very seamless look. The only screws you see are at the very top. Things you have never done before seem so scary, and we nearly paid $660 for someone else to do this, but it was so easy, even cutting through the bricks. We are so glad we took the leap and did it ourselves. This is our new vent. We have it on. Brian's going to turn it off. Oh, that's really cool. Shall we test it? Alexa, fan on.
Okay.
Oh. That's pretty sweet. When I look back at these before photos, I can hardly believe it's the same kitchen. It's just so different. And I'm so thankful for Ikea's online kitchen planner. I really do not think we could have done this without that starting point. If you've seen the walkthrough video I did earlier, in the description I say it took us 10 months to finish the renovation. And you're probably thinking, wow, they're slow. But we took our time because of our two dogs. One of them, Tootsie, is blind, and she requires a lot of our attention, and we are happy to give it to her. So we did not want to stress out the dogs to do this kitchen renovation. So we took our sweet time, and we took many breaks and went on trips, and did not worry about doing things quickly. Most of the work was accomplished while Tootsie took a nap, and we kept an eye on her using a camera. Since we were doing the other living areas at the same time, this small room became our only living area. We did not intend to make a YouTube video. In fact, all the videos we have are from text messages I sent to my daughter, Kathy. And we got to thinking about the obstacles we encountered, and there were so many. And then we got to thinking about how we solved each one, and thought perhaps our experience would encourage others to give it a try and not to worry about obstacles, because you always find a way to get around them. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and please watch my future videos. I hope to be helpful.